So let's take a look at the operator file again. In the operator file, we can take a look, and we have the operator initials, we have groups and branches. So if we look at the policy file, the policy or system control information, let's take something really simple like company number, pound company. Okay, everything that starts with a pound sign indicates that it's a counter. So counters are handled a little uniquely differently. When we talked yesterday, we talked about resetting system preferences. Normally, when a policy record is loaded for the first time, it gets buffered in a memory array so that when it gets referenced again, the system doesn't have to go to disk and ask for it. The exception to that are parameters or policy records that start with a pound sign. The system never buffers those because it wouldn't make any sense to buffer counters. So here we have a counter. This is the last company account number issued. This is just some information for our doc, what module it is, what category it is, whether or not it's a user control, and then a little documentation. Now, the primary key for a counter is the code and then the user. The user is normally blank. If we sort here by user, we can see that there are some policy records that have usernames in them. So if we take a look at this item here, let's find one. Okay, here's, for example, a policy record, menu add R. So I'll go back and look at the code. So here we have two records for that policy. We have a global record, which indicates that nobody can add to the role E menu. And we have a record specific to my user initials. So what happens is every time the system goes out and looks for a control record, which will be either a policy record or a text data record, and we'll talk about that in the future, the first thing it does is checks, does the user have a user-specific policy? If it does, it uses it. If it doesn't have a user-specific policy, then it goes through the branch information and looks for a policy record that has a branch code in it. If it doesn't find one for that, it loops through all of the groups that the operator is part of and checks if there's a policy record for that group. And you can see the policy records. If we go back to user, and you can see these are groups. A record for a control record for a group is ++ and then the group ID, one character letter. So you can have 26 different groups or 26 different roles. If it's a branch, it's --, and then the branch ID, you can have up to 39 different branches, A through Z, 0 through 9. And in fact, you probably can have another 26 by using a small letter. So the logic is first look if there's a user-specific control record. If not, check for a branch. If not, check for the groups that the user belongs to. If not, then use the global record. And if none of the control records exist, then it uses whatever the system default is. So if we go back to the menu, we see that we have two records here, for allowing adding to the role E. Nobody can do it except me. Then the same thing with the adding to the group menus. If we wanted to, for example, allow Felix. Felix is a guy in our Basel operation in Switzerland. We would then create a menu record, put user ID FH, say yes. And now you see we have globally nobody can do it, but Felix and Frank can do it. If we wanted to say we want to allow only people in the management group to do it, and we have a management group that's, let's say, role M, we would do ++M, and now people in the management group would be allowed to add records. This same logic holds true for policy records and for text data records. A text data record is similar to a policy record, except it can contain a larger amount of data. The info field is only 8 or 10 characters long. In a text data record, you can have up to 32,000 or 64,000 bytes. Now, there are some exceptions here, as always. You notice there's a whole bunch of records that have use des in the info. And let's take a look at that. So for example, here we have a credit card control record. This happens to be where credit cards get authorized at authorize.net. So if you note, this is more than the number of characters that will fit into the info field. So if you set up a system parameter policy record and you need a longer piece of data than will fit in info, you can put use des in the info and it will then go get the value out of the description. This is something that we did 25 years ago before we implemented the text data record. Nowadays, this type of information is in text data. So let me take a quick look over there. I can show you what that is. Text data records have a type. On this screen, you can scope in on the types. If you're lazy, you can click this prompt button. It goes out and does an SQL query and shows you what all the different types are available. And then here, for example, is let's find something. Okay, here's a message. This is a message that gets print on emailed invoices. As a default, it's too long to put into a policy record, so we put it into a text data record, which has a type, a code, an ID, and a user ID. The user ID is the same logic as the user over here in the system control files. It can either be blank, which means it's global. It can be a specific user's initials, or it can be a group or a branch. So let's say you had a warehouse that you're shipping out of in either Mexico or in Canada from an online system, and you wanted the message on the Canadian invoices to Quebec to be in French. You could set up a branch record for your Quebec warehouse, and then it would print the message on there or the subject in French. So the way we find policy and control records is consistent throughout the whole system. user-specific, branch group, or global. In the system control file, we can see all sorts of stuff are stored in there. We have all of our counters. Then after the counters, we have control parameters, and these control parameters have names that are only logical to the programmers that wrote this. These ones that start with numbers are really old ones from a pre-Windows version, where instead of having one big stream executable, the character mode version has lots of little programs, and they were numbered. The newer policies have some sort of mnemonic logic to them. For example, here, allo track allocation information in the operator history file. That's used for debugging. We turn it off, yes and no. Accounts payable parameters tend to start with AP. So we have, for example, the maximum number of invoices on a check. You can set that here. The number of vertical lines to skip on the form between the vendor and invoice detail. So all sorts of stuff that's variable on a site-specific or behavioral topic. The information is set in the system control file, and there's something like 10 or 12,000 different policies that you can set. For example, here, allow editing of accounts payable account during AP invoice entry. Many times when a customer has a very specific need that we don't want to change the default behavior of the system, we'll add a control policy, and that control policy will allow the customer to set the behavior on their site to be the way they want it without affecting everybody else. So the normal procedure is the customer will email us, ask for a non-standard behavior. We'll add that to the code. They'll see that it's been added in the update notes that are on our documentation help system that I showed you yesterday, and then they'll upload or download an update and then set the policy the way they want it. So if we don't have any more questions on the system control file, we'll move on to back to text data and look at the different type of things that we store in text data. If we look at the types, we can see here we have 3PL. 3PL is for third-party logistics, lets you set a ship from address. If we look at, here's some EDI stuff. If we look at EDI, this tells us, let's see, what's a good one to look at? Here we have, for example, EDI 850 ends. This is where we would store the SQL query that is used when generating the list on the EDI dashboard. And we'll have a whole session tomorrow or the next day on SQL queries, but we store the SQL queries are stored in text data records. This allows you to modify them on a site-by-site basis or us to change them without having to install a new version of Stream. Let's see what other stuff we have in text data. Oh, here we have browse control records. If we go back here and look at our company browse customer management that we looked at yesterday, we'll see that we have, remember, we have different index sequences that can be displayed. If you go up here and you say Browse Properties, it will send some stuff to the output window. And it tells us here, this is the Browse Parf record, CCR-MCOMP. So we can go over here and we can see that here are the control records for the different indexes in the browse. It's something that you normally never ever need to look at, but it's an example of the type of stuff that we store in text data. The stream system is a little different from normal SQL-based systems. If you have a system like Genius or SAP or Oracle, instead of having one file like we have a text data manager file, they will have a separate table for each set of information. So a typical SAP system might have 4,000 to 5,000 different tables, which makes it a real pain to manage because you lose the ability to get a good overview of your tables and your data structures. We've got about 125 tables, so instead of having hundreds of additional tables, we put the stuff inside of one table and then use types to group different sets of records together to make it a little bit easier to maintain. So here's a typical browse control record. If we look at this one, this is the company index. The company index, it tells us what the first field is, and then shows us that the first column is field 5. It's 30 wide. It's a left justified, and gives us the column title and then the number of pixels that the column is wide. So technical information, not a lot of interest to anybody, because the way you normally edit it, you saw it yesterday, where you would go in here and say add a column, insert a column. You would change the width like this with the cursor, and every time you do that, that actually updates this file, this record here in text data. But it's show you it's a typical type of thing that we store in text data. Let's see what else we would have in there. Okay, here's a typical thing that you might edit. SHP is for shipping. This is for the carrier, and this allows us to set what URL we go to when we drill down from the invoice lookup to see shipping information. In this case, we're going to FedEx. Here's the URL, this section here, and then the system replaces this token here with the actual tracking number that it gets from the manifest records. So in order to not hard code this, we put this in a text data record. When FedEx or UPS changes what they're going to do, you can just modify the text data record instead of having to get a new version of code, so that we don't have to release a new exe every time there's an information change from a third party. Other stuff we put in here, oh, this is real common, SQL. We store all of our SQL queries here in the text data record. Let's find one, for example. This is an AR summary invoice aging by due date by customer. So the SQL record is stored in here so that if it gets modified, we only have to modify data. We don't have to, again, release another version of code. Normally, the SQL records, you don't modify directly with a text data editor. You see these records have section identifiers, for example, description, SQL code, special information, additional field, columns, totals. Those sections are used to display the different sections in the SQL edit prompt, which I'll show you when we get to that in a future training session. So that's system control parameters. Oh, also in text data, we store information that you normally get to with a user interface. System administration, let's say field defaults. When you add a new customer, and you do that by hitting the insert key or the plus key here, you'll see it brings up the customer detail panel, and it has various information filled in already. These are site-specific defaults, and these you maintain over here off the system administration menu by going into the appropriate record. Here's, for example, the company record. And then you can see we default to Florida, we default the country to US, customer type to C, status to A, the rep defaults to the current operator. Now this raises an interesting feature in DataFlex. In DataFlex, the language we use, you have something called an expression evaluator. The expression evaluator means evaluate anything within parentheses. We can use that in code, but we can also use that in data. So when the system initializes a new company record, it goes through this text data record and looks at what all the field values are. And if it sees that there's a field value in parentheses, it then evaluates what's in the parentheses and uses that value. So in this case, it sees that there's a global variable called GS operator in parentheses. So it then sets the rep to whoever the current operator is. And we can look over here. New record data. And we can say here, okay, this is the raw data that this program displays. So that you can edit it in here, but it's a little more tedious to edit in here than it is to edit it over here. And we see all the different things that we can set. We set the terms to prepaid, the credit limit, finance charges. Now, back over here on text data, you'll notice that we have two records for company default. We have the defaults, and then we have another one here for user ~PS. And what this does is this says, use these company defaults when you're in the point of sale system. Don't use the regular company defaults, because your regular company defaults may have terms, ship via UPS, and stuff like that, whereas the point of sale defaults are going to be pickup and cash sale, so that you can have different defaults not only by operator, branch, group, and global, you can also have them by function. Now, another place where this is relevant would be with the website. For example, if you have a website where an e-commerce, where you allow new customers to set themselves up, you can have a different set of defaults for self-setup customers on the website, retail, or self-setup resale customers on the website, so that you get the default information that you need for the particular situation. Over here on the field default setup, you can also pick what type of group you want, the different branches, the different groups, the different types. So that's another use of the text data. We can also go over here and look at field name display setup, which would be, I showed you yesterday how we can change the field names in records. So let's look at one. And let's say we don't like the field name risk level. So as a sysop, we can go in and say, let's change the field level to how risky. So now we have the name changed to how risky, and we can do a refresh here. Let's go out of this and go back in. And we'll look at file 54, which was the customer. And we'll see here, we have a new record that says in file 54, field number 205, which is company risk level. We want to display how risky, and we can change the status help to this. So now when we go back into that view and go into the detail panel, we'll see that the field is now called how risky. And if you note, the risk, this down here is the status help. This hasn't changed because status help gets loaded the first time the view gets loaded. So the next time we loaded stream, we would get down here the new text that we put in, how much risk are we taking on this customer. If you're a sysop, you can change the field labels here, or you can go in to the display name setup and change it over here. Again, it's a text data record. Another thing we store in text data are the field masks. For different fields, you can have different field masks. So let's see if we can change one in here. Let's see. Oh, okay, here. We could change this field mask and say, I don't want to have 4 decimals for this one. I only want 2 decimals. So next time I load this program, this field is only going to display 2 decimals. Then the other thing I can do, let's see, we did defaults, display name. Okay, security is also stored in a text data record. We can set it from the screen here. So if I wanted to take the how risky and say, I don't want to have everybody be able to change the terms. So I could right click here, set the field security, and say, I want this to only be view only. Now the field security here, if I go back into this, we'll see now we've added a record, file 54, field 49, company terms is now view only. So Again, that information is stored in a text data record. So that gives you an idea what type of stuff we store in there, why we store it in there. The other system file that's used very commonly is the Gencode file. So let's say here we have outside sales reps. If you want to control what data can be put into a field, you can set up a Gencode table, and that Gencode table says this field can only have these values in it. I showed you yesterday, this one over here doesn't have that, but we could set up a Gencode table, and let's do that. And the table name is F5422. So we can go over here to the Gencode manager. We can say insert F5422. Call it the territory table. And now we can put values and say Northeast, Southeast. Now, if we went back over to this, and we hit F3, we would see that we are now restricted to only those two values are allowed in this field. Once the field is set up, if we're a sysop, we can actually edit the table in C2 and say Southwest, like that, apply, and now those are the values. Now, one of the things that you have to be careful with is if you create a Gencode table on a field, you now have a situation that those are the only valid entries for that. One of the things that Stream does, whenever you save a record, it validates all of the data in that record and any parent records. So if we take a sales order, for example, a parent record for a sales order is the company record. So if we were to go into a sales order now that had a parent company record that did not have one of these entries in the territory, we would not be able to save that sales order because we have invalid data in a parent record. And that's a really important thing to know, because you can bring your whole system to a screeching halt by setting up a validation record for a customer record or a catalog record without going through and making sure that all of the catalog records or customer records have valid data in them. That's a really important thing to emphasize, that you can really shoot yourself in the foot by saying, I want this restricted to these values, and not having values in the actual data. So I've got to be real careful with that. So I'm going to go over to the Gencode and now delete these records, because otherwise I will have shot myself in the foot. Well, it tells me I got to zoom in, delete it. It says, okay, I got to delete the table entries first. So I go into here. Now this warns you here, if you delete a code that you have in use, you will disable use of some records till you update them. So if I delete this Gencode table entry NW, and I have company records that have NW in them, I will have succeeded in blocking anybody from saving a company record that has that invalid data in it. Okay, now I have undone what I did with the Gencode record. So now at this point, I can put any value in there and the system doesn't object. If I go here where I have a table and I put a value in there, it tells me that it's an invalid value. Now, one of the things the users will run into who don't read very well is that if you screwed something up in a parent record by adding a Gencode table and they try to save a sales order for that customer, they're going to get an invalid value message just like this, and they're going to get terribly confused because they're not going to understand what it is. So you got to be very careful when you add validation. That validation takes effect immediately and can really shoot you in the foot. So other stuff that we have in the Gencode, for example, everything that's F and a number all indicates that they are file validations. We have, for example, the roles and group list is in here. These are the standard roles and groups that the system has: payables, receivable, accountants. These can be added to or removed from on a site-by-site basis. We have, for example, here's a typical Gencode. These are inventory cost adjustment codes. When you go into a catalog record or an inventory record and you're changing the cost, the system is going to say, why are you changing the cost? And you can select one of these codes. You have inventory quantity adjustment tables where you're going into the system and you're adjusting a quantity up or down. It's going to ask you, why are you adjusting this quantity? Bin count, was it defective? Was there a quantity variance? And you can set up the different variations of text that you can use to describe why you're doing an inventory adjustment. Language codes, for example, the list of languages that you're going to support in your system. The let's see what else we have. The price levels that you support in your system. The SCAC codes. These are all the standard shipping codes that are used in the EDI systems. You maintain them here in a Gencode table. Country, for example. This is a list of all of the countries that you can pick when you're setting up a customer. In addition to, and these are all ISO, International Standards Organization, country codes. In the Gencode record, there's some additional fields. You have the table name, you have the code, you have a description, and then here we store the phone mask and the ShipRush, which is the shipping software, what country code they use, and then also whether or not we accept payments via the website from that country. So you'll note that when we're in a customer record, that we get this formatting of the phone number. Now, if we would go to someone who's international, for example, here's Burkhart, And you'll notice here that this phone number formatting is different. And it's gone over to this different formatting because it's country Switzerland. So we can look over here in the country table, search for CH, and we can see that here is the phone mask for that country. So the Gencode records can have not only the table restrictions, but other information associated with a table. Now, what we do to try to make editing easier is we store the screen labels for every Gencode type in the system. The actual Gencode record has a lot of fields in it. But for the country, we're only using 4 fields. So we set up the field labels in a control record that controls the control record. And then when we go into the appropriate Gencode table, we only see the fields that we need. If we look at a different Gencode, let's say, for example, the state code table, and we look at a state Gencode record, we'll see that we don't have this one hasn't been set up with a control record to display the fields. So what we can do is we can go in if we want to and set one up. And say we're going to call the description the state name. We're going to put in data 4, we're going to say, where is data 4? If we delete the control record, okay, data underscore 4. So interesting. Where is data underscore 4? Ah, there it is. Country, state or province, and data 1 is, don't know what that is. So now when we go into a Gencode table for state, we just see the fields that are relevant for us. The reason we have country for the state Gencode table is that when you're picking a state and the country is set to US, you only get the US states. If you're in Canada and you pop up the Gencode list for the state field, you'll only get the Canadian provinces. If you're in Germany and you pop up the state list, you only get the Bundesländer like Bavaria, Westphalia, and Hanover, Ostfriesland, stuff like that. So this way you don't get this really long list of all possible states. You get ones that are scoped for the relevant country, that are relevant for the country that you're in. Then we have, for example, tax types. Gencode has the different tax types that we support, and these are also tied to used by customers and invoices. When you set up a customer, you have to set up what type of customer it is. Is it exempt? That means they don't pay sales tax like the US government or state governments. Is it an export? Is it a government sale? Is it a resale? Is it retail? So you can see over here in a customer record, accounting, the tax types here, these tax types are stored in the Gencode table. That's a little different from the tax codes. The tax codes are stored in a data file because you can have hundreds of different tax codes. For example, the state of California has 84 different tax codes because they've got 84 different taxing districts. Florida has about 30 different tax codes. So those are actually stored in a separate table, not in a Gencode file. So we have any questions on text data, Gencode, or the system parameters? Any questions you'd like answered on that? Oh, Rob, you got something?
Yes, Frank. Hey, I just had a quick question on system control file maintenance.
Okay.
When we're in there, you were referring to the codes for that and how you can add for somebody. Like for our intent, we usually do the like sorel prev for holds, like what
Okay.
hold someone can and can't do. I was just wondering, like, so for example, you were saying that if someone's defined in there, there's the global one without a user, then there can be a user specific record with one user on it, and then the system checks against the groups as well and the
Yes.
branch. I was
Yes.
just wondering if there's a conflict in that. Like, let's say someone's globally set to no, the user is set to yes, they're in a group that is set to no, and the branch maybe says yes. What's the order of operations? Or like who wins over who?
The order of operations is the first thing it checks is the most specific, which is user specific.
Hmm.
The next thing it checks is and if it finds one, it uses it. If it finds a record. Then it checks the branch because the branch information tends to be branch important. For example, branch information is commonly set up for things like from each of your warehouses, you're going to have different UPS, FedEx shipping numbers. So if it finds a branch record, it uses it. Then it looks for a group and it finds the first group record it finds for that user, it uses it. So if you have the user as part of 4 groups, whichever the first group it finds, based on going through the operator's group record from left to right. If you put the groups in A, B, C, it'll search A first, B then, and then C. And as soon as it finds one, it jumps out and uses it. If you say the C group is more important, then you put, C, A, B, and then if it finds a C record, it'll use that. And then if it hasn't found a record in any of the groups, then it uses the global value.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So, and if it doesn't find a value anywhere, then it uses the system defined behavior. And in the case of the holds here, if there's no record for SO hold 8, then it will not use that hold when auditing.
Thank
Oh,
you.
okay, so let's see. Let's look at long code, which is another one of these system control files. Long code is used to store policy and control information that requires a key that's more than one field. So let's take a look, try to find something that makes sense. Okay, here we go. Let's look at go into the catalog for a moment. And let's find a catalog record. Let me search by prod line. Nope, I don't have drives. Let me see if I have monitors. monitors. Yeah, okay. Just have to use an example here. Okay, in the more specs here, you can say this catalog record is part of, I want to use a different label set to store different information. So for example, for a hard drive, I may want to store capacity, form factor, RPM. For a monitor, I want to store type, size, refresh rate, resolution. So in order to change these labels, not system-wide, like I showed you earlier, but to change them based upon the product you're looking at, you can set, this is set up here in the long code record. And the reason it's done in long code is that you have to define a set. This is called catalog label set. You then have to say, okay, this is field U3 over here. And the set, the type of, or the grouping is monitors. So the long code file is used when to identify a control record. I don't just have a single control code. I may have up to 5 fields that need to be loaded in order to find that control record. And this one was an example of that. Other things that we store in long code. Oh, here, for example, this is a system internal one. For example, did you know? So the code set is did you know? The name is image import confirmation, and here is a set of initials. So this control, when we put in a new feature in the system, we put a did you know line in the code, and the first time that the operator goes into that view where there's been a change, it'll pop up a did you know message, and the operator then has an option of saying, don't show this to me again. If they click on that, it goes out and creates a long code record for code set did you know, the specific information tidbit, and the user's initials. So the next time the user goes into that view, it checks the long code record to see, did we already display this to the operator, and did the operator say, I don't want to see it again? So this is a situation where the key to this control is 3 segments: the code set, the identifier, and the initials. And here in long code, we can also set up screen labels. And we'll set this one up and say feature and initials. So if I save this, now when I go into this did you know long code, it only shows me the fields that are relevant for this particular code set. This label stuff is something we added a couple of years ago, and we're slowly going through and adding these labels to all the different code sets in Gencode and in long code, so that it makes it a little easier to maintain. So that's long code. What else do we store in here that's of interest? The language stuff is stored in here. The system can do multi-language. So we can go over here to tables files and say, so let's pick German. and we'll say, okay, you can see here that whenever the operator language is switched to German, whenever it says close, it's going to say schließen, which is German for close. Whenever it says help, it's going to say Hilfe. If you have here, for example, monthly usage is monatlicher Bedarf, you can go in and say, I only want to see the translated ones. So this gives you here's where we store all the different translations for all the screen labels and phrases. Or you can say, not translated, and these are all the ones that haven't been translated yet. So that's what the long code is used for. Now, associated with the long code, originally we would actually store transactional data in here, but over time we decided that that was untidy. So we added another file called Tran Data, and Tran Data has the same format as the long code table, but contains transactional data. For example, box detail. This tells you when you create a shipment and you create a manifest record, the box detail records tell you what's in the box, and it has the invoice number, box number, the item, a lot serial number, and a description. So we are in the process over time of moving transactional stuff that we have in long code over to Tran Data. So the long code is only control information and Tran Data is only transactional information. Well, that uses up our hour. Open for any questions, open for any ideas, what we cover tomorrow, to try to keep this relevant for the participants that we have on the first or inaugural training attempt. So speak up if you have any comments, any questions, anything you'd like to see on tomorrow's session. Okay, if we don't, Rob.
Oh, yes, I was just going to say thank you and nothing in particular. Just going through the menus like this, I appreciate. So whatever works for me for tomorrow.
Okay, my plan tomorrow is I had on today's agenda, which we didn't get to because obviously there was a lot to say about the pieces I talked about. Tomorrow I'm going to go through the catalog record and its parents, inventory normalization and bin, and then company contact parents, ship tos, more detail on the tax type, tax code, zip code, demand, ship vias, and buying groups. So start getting into the data. Once we've talked about catalogs and companies, then in the following session we can start looking at actual processing, sales order flow, invoicing, shipping.
Great. Thanks again.
That's the plan. Thank you kindly for participating, and we'll talk to you guys tomorrow.